Mixing shader and matcap for comic style renderers. So we're still with them here. In this section, we're going to be multiplying the power of a single matcap by 4, and we're going to use the quad shader to build our next comic material. You'll find that there are heaps of applications for this technique, but in this tutorial, concentrate on creating a comic material we can use with or without polypaint. So basically what we're going to do, when we go in here to our, you're going to see there is matcap materials here and standard materials here. You won't have a quad shader in here anymore, I don't believe. In fact, the most layered shader you're going to have in here is if you go into your comma key, go into your materials here, and you won't have any of this stuff either, but you'll have the double dots O metal. If you double click that one, let's go ahead and hit comma key to go out of that. This one here, if we go into our material settings, you're going to see underneath modifiers, you're going to have S1, S2, and S3. S4 is going to be grayed out, and that's going to be the quad material. If you want the quad material, you're going to want to go into the comic style rendering and go to the part 1. We did this here, and is the quad shader in here? Maybe not. Let me go track down that quad shader because I do have it. Okay, so what you can do is go in here to the super comic. That is the quad shader. So here's the Poblander Super Comic. You can see there's S1, S2, S3, S4. This is basically what we're going to be making. You can start here and just zero out these options here, change any of those, or you can just start here. I mean, that'll save you some time. But if you want just a quad shader, and we're going to be following along. Let me go ahead and grab that real quick. I think I have that on my Z material. So if you want to know how to get this, like this comic style rendering in my materials tab in my Lightbox, all it is, and we're going to throw something else in there. We're going to go to File Explorer. We're going to go to our ZBrush 4R8 folder, Z materials, and then we've got the comic style rendering folder in there, and I'm just going to copy quad shader in here. So this will be what we can start out with. For you guys, if you're just downloading the resources, just start with the Poblander, this material here that we're going to be making, and you'll already be done. But at least you can watch me go through it and kind of get to that, or arrive at that. And we'll go ahead and kill ZBrush real quick. We're going back through here, so let's see what he has to say about the quad shader. Let's start by understanding the quad shader and defining some terminology. So the quad shader is a material in ZBrush that has 4 inputs, S1, S2, S3, and 4, which we just talked about a little bit. So let's go ahead and grab that quad shader that we put into our comic style rendering here. There it is, quad shader. Now, when you double click anything in here, it's going to take your default, whatever you had selected by default, which in this case was, I think, matcap red wax, if I had to guess. It will replace that. If you want these to show up every time you start up ZBrush, what you want to do is go to File Explorer here, and we'll go to ZBrush 4R8 Z Startup, and then Materials. If you throw it in here, these will load up with ZBrush every time you load up ZBrush. So just something to keep in mind. So you're going to want to select a material in here that you'd like. If you do Reflect Red, and then you go into your renderer here and you do grab this one, it's going to replace that Reflect Red with that new comic material here. So something to keep in mind here. Anyway, we'll go back to our quad shaders here, go under modifiers. Oops, not that, brush modifiers. We want to go to material modifiers here. There you go. And now we got S1, S2, S3, and S4 for the quad shader here. There's an in-depth explanation about this in Poblander's tutorial about making a skin material for BPR, if you want more info on that. So the 4 inputs in the quad shader are simple channels in which you can insert either a matcap or another single shader. So basically you can go through here and you can adjust the settings for each of these, or you can also copy. So you see that copy SH. So you can go in here to another material here, you can do copy that shader, and then you can go back in here to your quad shaders and you can paste SH into any one of these channels and get that. And you can also mix here's your matcap materials, here's your standard materials. This is all standard material properties here. You can also put in a matcap. So you're going to see the matcap. You got depth A and depth B and all that stuff we talked about last time. You can paste those into these as well, so you can kind of mix and match. So we'll be getting into that. Let's divide some terms. So shader for this tutorial refer as a shader as any standard material from ZBrush. So the shaders will be any of these standard materials. Matcap. We should be pretty clear on the matcaps because we've already gone over that and what they are, but any shader that is driven by an image is called a matcap. And again, just to recap the matcaps, we go to green metallic here, for example, you scroll down, this image right here is dictating how our model is being rendered in ZBrush. Material, at the end of the day, a matcap or a shader or a quad shader is a material, but for the illustrative purpose of this tutorial, I'll call a material something made out of a combination of shaders and matcaps. And this will be a reusable shader, so once we're done tweaking the shader, we can save it out, and then you can tweak it and then save out variants as well. These are all the screenshots using the same material, but using a small value change to get all these different looks with the Super Comic Quad Shader. And that's the one I pulled up for you guys when I went at the material. Here's the Publinder Super Comic Shader there. So let's get started. First, we're going to create the basis of the material using a shader. So go to the material palette and select the Skin Shader 4. So we're going to start with Skin Shader 4 here. And that was just in the basic materials here, down here in Skin Shader 4. Very versatile shader, and is a great one for what we want to start with. This is also going to be the channel 1 of our quad shader. So we'll start by copying the Skin Shader 4. So when we grab the Skin Shader 4 and we've got the material loaded up over here, if you don't, just open up this little docking station over here, go to Material, grab that dot, and just drag it over here. And then we've got this. Now we can do the copy SH, and now we're going to go back into our quad shader that we had loaded in and start by copying the Skin Shader 4 into the first channel of the comic material. So with the Skin Shader 4 selected under the modifiers subpalette, you have 2 buttons. Do copy SH, which we just did, and now we need to go find the quad shader under the standard materials palette. And then once you have it selected, you'll see 4 channels. Click the first one, which is S1, and select it, and make sure it's pressed orange, and then do the paste SH, and that's going to paste all of those Skin Shader 4 settings into this S1 here. The little dots on each channel let it turn on and off the visibility for that channel. So if we go through here, these are all visible now. So let's go ahead and hit Control-N to clear our canvas. And let's go ahead and load in probably what he's going to be using here. So we'll go to Streaming, Comic Rendering, Resources, Z-Tools, and the Kepler bust here. Go ahead and load that up. Go into Edit mode. You're going to see as I turn these extra options off here, this is just basically the Skin Shader 4. So because we turned all of these other S's off, and you can blend, well, we'll get to that, but basically we've got the Skin Shader 1, it's on, it's got an open circle. If you turn it off, it disappears. So this one's active and it's on, it's open circle. Now if we go back down here to our Skin Shader 4, it looks pretty much the same because we just copied those parameters into this material here. So we'll go back to our quad shader that has the Skin Shader copied into it. And now we have our base shader ready to start, but before we can see what it does or how it really looks on our model, we need to turn off all the other channels. The idea with the base shader is to create the first pass or the basic outline of our comic material. So we're going to be creating an outline with this one. Remove all or most of the shading and create a few subtle dark contour lines. So yeah, so go ahead and turn off all the other channels like we just did. Now creating a quick shadeless material with the black outlines is not hard. We could simply use the technique from the previous section and just build up a matte cap. If you missed the previous section, go to part 1, and when I edit these all together, it'll probably be one long video, or maybe I'll break it up into sections. We'll see how it goes. The reason I want to use a shader like Skin Shader 4 is because it will give us the option to do some simple shading or specular later on if we want to. So it'll give us a little bit more leeway as opposed to baking it into a matte cap and then having to go back into Photoshop or use matte cap or light cap to tweak. We can just use sliders to kind of dictate how the look is going to go. Go ahead and turn the ambient and the specular sliders all the way down to 0. So here's the ambient, boom, and specular, boom. So we turn off the specular, we turn off any ambient lighting that was built into the shader. Doing this will get rid of any ambient lighting and leave it specular contour. So we just have the diffuse to tweak now. At this point, I like to turn on the polypaint of the model or simply select any color other than black or white. The idea is that the shader should not affect the color so that we can use it on any other model with any polypaint. In other words, we're creating a material for the line work only. So for example, I don't think this one has any polypaint here, so when I turn this on, if you did want to polypaint something real quick, super simple. We got our standard brush here, just turn off Z-Add. We've got RGB selected, and we can go through here. If you want to kind of crisp up that alpha as you draw, because you're going to notice that if we go in here, let's go ahead and fill him with we'll kind of follow along here. So we'll do kind of a muted green here. We're going to go to color, fill object here, and then we'll go ahead and grab kind of an orangish red here, and we'll go ahead and go through here and we'll start painting. Now you can mask first. You can hold down Control, and looks like he's got these things here. So you can go through here and you can kind of mask these areas first, and then you can just do color fill if that's what you want to do. So we'll do that first. We'll go through here and we'll mask. Let's just keep this simple. We'll just do a couple sections here. So we'll mask this little section here, and this is a decimated mesh, so it's painting on the vertices. It's giving you vert color. So if you don't have very many verts, it's going to be a little blocky. So what you might need to do is subdivide this first. So I'm going to hit Control D, and that'll do our geometry subdivide. And now we've got a little bit more resolution, and you're going to see you're going to get a much nicer mask and a much nicer poly paint here. So we'll go ahead and mask this in, and I can do a sloppy mask first, because then what we can do, sharpen this up a little bit. I'm going to hold down Control Alt, and that'll tap, and that'll kind of sharpen up our mask. That's also underneath masking here, And where are we at? Sharpen mask is here, but again, Control Alt will go ahead and do that. If you want to blur your mask, just Control Tap, and that'll blur it out. But we'll go ahead and sharpen that up. And now we can go through here and just do a quick cleanup pass. So we'll go ahead and unmask all of this stuff here. If you want to, you can also go in here to your mask, hold down Control, go to Mask Curve, and then you can use your mask curve here. You can tap Alt once and then hold down Alt, and that'll unmask anything past that line. So you kind of use that to go ahead and clean up your masking as well. But anyways, once you've got this kind of cleaned up here, and I'm not going to do a perfect job here because it's not about poly painting or masking, it's about stylized rendering. But I do want to go ahead and show you, if you wanted to make your object look like the one in the PDF here, you could do this, mask it, invert that mask, and then with this color selected and RGB turned on for standard brush, go to Color, Fill Object, and that'll go ahead and fill that up. If you wanted to just paint with a color here, if you go down here to black, and then RGB selected, you don't have to mask, you just go in here and paint. If you want to, you can go into your alphas and you can kind of sharpen up that edge, and you can also go in here to, my screen's really small, so I can go here to focal shift and drag that focal shift down, and that'll also kind of have the effect of sharpening up your edge border there. So either one of those, or you can use both, and now you can go through here and kind of poly paint that in. If you want to, if you kind of overshoot your bounds a little bit and you want to clean it up, just hover over this color here and hit C. That'll go ahead and color select that, and then you can go through here and just paint this color on top of your previous color. So we've got that, we've got poly paint here. So now we're just using this shader, like you said before, just to do the line work here. Now there are some modifiers on the Skin Shader 4 that we don't really want to have on. So change Colorize Diffuse, Colorize Specular, and Anisotropic Diffuse and Anisotropic Specular, switching all those to 0. So let's start from the top. Let's go Colorize Diffuse here, which is this shader here, that's at 0. Colorize Specular is, whoops, there we go. So here's Colorize Specular, it's at 100. We'll go ahead and change that down to 0. Colorize Diffuse is at 0. Anisotropic Diffuse is right here. We'll go ahead and put that at 0. Anisotropic Specular we'll put at 0. And High Dynamic Range is going to be put at 1. There we go. So we'll go ahead and standardize all that. We end up with a very basic material that's basically controlled with the diffuse amount and the diffuse curve alone. We'll leave the diffuse slider at 100. So we'll go ahead and crank that up to 100 if it's not. But the diffuse curve is what does the magic trick. So play around with the curve, but we're going to roughly look for this shape here. So if you go here to the diffuse curve and click on it, you're going to see we by default this long sloping curve. So in order to make this shape, what you can do is you can, and this is just curve basics, just out of all of ZBrush uses the same curve functionality. So as we drag this around, you're going to see it does different things to our object. But to make this curve, you just drag this orange dot around. If you want to add another orange dot, just click on that curve. It'll make you another one. You can take this outer ring and kind of make this harder. You can go like sharper or softer fall off here. If you want to do a super sharp fall off, what you need to do is take the dot, drag it off, and then drag it back on, and then I'll give you a super sharp curve here. So now you can do kind of stepped looks like this. To delete a curve, just take the dot here and just drag it off, and I'll go ahead and delete it. If you want to reset, you can hit reset and just start over. And it looks like here we've got an orange dot in the upper left, orange dot in the lower left, upper right, and we've got 2 dots here. So I'm going to take this dot here. We're going to go ahead and do a sharp fall off. So we'll drag off, drag on, and then we'll put it here, and then we'll make another dot here, and then drag off, drag on, and we'll kind of push this out a little bit. So that's the diffuse curve that he's looking for. With that curve shape, you should be getting something that looks like the image below with some sharp and subtle black outlines. So let's go ahead and see if we're matching that here. And we'll turn that poly paint off so you can kind of see, we'll match this up here. So image below with some sharp and subtle black outlines, but you can also see a little bit of the volume. So there's nice ink lines going on here that are very contrasty, but there's also a little bit of subtle shading as well. We can still see some shadows that help define the volumes, but those have nothing to do with the material. The shadows you see are simply preview shadows here. So as you know, the shadow kind of starts playing in here, that's under the render menu here. Render preview shadows. So you can turn deep shadow on and off, and you can do the object shadow. You can drag that down to 0 if you want to. I turned the deep shadow off and the object shadow to 0. Okay, let's do it. There we go. Cool. I think this is very exciting because we managed to create this with only one modifier of a simple shader. Since we're using the shader and not a matte cap, this means we can also affect the outlines or shadows just by changing the light position. That's another thing too. So the matte caps have lighting built in, but lighting will actually affect this object here. So that's totally cool because it's not a matcap material with the lighting baked in. It's a standard material here. Okay, so to change the light, let's go ahead and take this light palette and we'll just drag this over here. And so we've got our light. We've got one light active and selected. If you want to select another light, just tap it once. That selects it, and then tap it again to turn it on. So now we've got 2 lights playing in here. But we'll stay simple. We'll just have this one light selected, one light on, and now we can kind of move this light around. So if we move it over here, that'll change that. We can move it down at the bottom here. And if you move this around to the back, you can take any light and you can just tap it once, and that'll scoot it around to the back there. There we go. And that'll go ahead and just give you like a rim light, or it's being lit from the other side here. So very, very cool. Oh man, that's so cool. I love it. Then you can just tap to bring it back around to the front here. So we'll go ahead and set that back to kind of where it was. Not only that, we can change the light color and intensity and the ambient light to quickly modify our comic look. So think about the possibilities. We were only 25% done with our comic materials here. So what he's saying is the light color here, we can go ahead and change this light color here to like a baby blue. And the ambient color here, the ambient is 3 here. So, and the ambient light, let's go to light properties here. Crank up the ambient. That was at 3. Oh, he chose a green color here. I was mixing with his other colors here. So we do a green color here, and then we turn our poly paint back on. That'll go ahead, and you know the light color is going to also affect the color that's on your mesh here. So very cool. So let's go ahead and change that back to white here, and light color, light intensity. Okay.